There is a kind of laughter that follows a man out of a room and down the road and all the way home. The kind that isn't really about him being funny. It's about people needing someone to point at so they don't have to look too hard at themselves. Calhoun County had plenty of that kind of laughter. And most of it, for about 6 months straight, was aimed at a 53-year-old retired Navy man named Reed Calloway, who just spent his last real savings on a farm that sat under 4 feet of brown water. They called him the Admiral of the Swamp. Said it loud enough in the diner that he could hear it from 2 tables over. Said it at the feed store, at the county clerk's office, at the gas station, where he filled up his truck every Thursday morning. One of the selectmen, a soft-handed man named Gerald Pruitt, who'd never worked a day of real labor in his life, told 3 different people that Reed Calloway must have left his good sense somewhere in the Persian Gulf, because no sane man pays $60,000 for a pond. Reed heard all of it. He just didn't say much back. That was a habit he'd picked up in 22 years of naval service. The understanding that the people who talk the most are usually the ones doing the least. He'd seen it on ships, in command structures, in the slow machinery of military bureaucracy. The loud ones were almost never the ones you needed to worry about. It was the quiet ones. The ones working in the background, the ones you didn't notice until it was too late. Those were the ones that mattered. Reed Calloway was a quiet one. And so was his German Shepherd Ranger. Ranger was 4 years old, 78 pounds, and had the kind of stillness that big, intelligent dogs carry like a second skin. He didn't bark at much. He watched everything. When Reed had brought him home from a military working dog adoption program 3 years earlier, after Reed's divorce, after the retirement paperwork cleared, after the particular silence of a house that used to have 2 people in it settled in like weather, Ranger had walked through the front door, sniffed every corner of the living room methodically, and then sat down next to Reed's chair and looked up at him like he was confirming that this was where he belonged. Reed had felt something close to gratitude for the first time in a long while. That was 3 years before the farm. 3 years of the 2 of them finding their footing in a world that had stopped making obvious sense to Reed somewhere around the 2nd year after discharge. The Navy had given him structure, purpose, and a version of himself he understood. Civilian life had given him a divorce settlement, a rented house with thin walls, and the particular exhaustion of pretending that everything was fine. The farm changed that. Even flooded, even ugly, even while everyone in the county was laughing, the farm changed something in Reed Calloway. Pay attention to what Ranger finds in that water, because it's the part of this story that explains everything. Reed had not planned on buying farmland. He'd planned on taking his savings, modest, hard-earned, the kind of money that didn't have much room for mistakes, and putting it towards something sensible. A small, commercial property, maybe. A rental house. Something that generated income rather than ate it. He'd driven past the Alderman track twice before he ever stopped, because both times it looked exactly like what it was. A flooded mess of a property with a rusted gate and a county sign nailed to the fence post saying, WATIR hazard, no trespassing. The 3rd time he stopped because Ranger shifted in the passenger seat and pressed his nose to the window glass. Reed had learned to pay attention when Ranger did that. He pulled over, got out, walked to the fence line. The water was still, and the color of creek silt, sitting maybe 3 feet deep at the low end, and deeper toward the center. Where the natural grade dipped, you could see the tops of fence posts poking up through the surface. A line of what might have been fruit trees. Just the upper branches visible, ran along what would have been the eastern edge of the property, if there had been dry ground to stand on. The sky reflected off the water perfectly, flat and silver. It was, in a strange way, almost beautiful. Ranger stood at the fence and stared out at it for a long time. Reed asked the county appraiser's office about it the next day. The land had been in the Alderman family for 3 generations before the old man, Hector Alderman, died without a will, and the heirs fought over it long enough that nobody maintained anything. And the drainage ditch that ran along the northwest corner got blocked. It had been underwater, to varying degrees, for 4 years. The county had assessed it at $11,000. The estate was asking $65,000. Reed offered $60,000. They took it the same afternoon. He called his daughter Mara that night to tell her. She was quiet for a moment and then said very carefully, "The way children learn to talk to parents they're worried about. Dad, have you had it inspected?" He told her the inspection didn't matter much because even the county assessor admitted the soil profile looked strong from the old surveys. She was quiet again. Then she said, "The people at the coffee shop are going to lose their minds." Reed said, "I know." She said, "Are you sure about this?" He looked at Ranger, who was lying at his feet with his head up and his ears forward, watching him with those steady amber eyes. Reed said, "No, but I'm doing it anyway." That was a Thursday. By Saturday, the whole county knew. By Monday, he had a nickname. What nobody in that diner, at that feed store, at that county clerk's office understood. What they couldn't have known because they hadn't stood at that fence line with a German shepherd pressing his nose to the glass and staring at the water like he could see through it. It wasn't just neglect. And it wasn't just the alderman's bad luck. The clock was already ticking, and the man who'd set it was sitting in an office 3 towns over, waiting for Reed to run out of patience. The first thing Reed did was hire a pump, not a small one, a commercial agricultural pump, the kind used for field drainage, the kind that moved serious volume. He ran a line from the lower northwest corner to the roadside drainage ditch, got the county to confirm the discharge permit in writing, and turned it on. He told no one what he expected to find. He wasn't entirely sure himself. But Ranger had stood at that fence for 40 minutes on the day Reed first stopped, and in 3 years of living with that dog, Reed had learned that 40 minutes of sustained attention meant something was there. The pump ran day and night. Reed camped on the property in a canvas tent he'd had since his second deployment, olive drab, army surplus, bought from a man leaving a base exchange in Bahrain. He cooked on a propane stove and let Ranger sleep at the tent entrance, which the dog did with the quiet authority of something that had decided it was on duty. On the 4th day, the water level had dropped roughly 18 inches. You could see the tops of old fence posts clearly now, could see the shape of the land beneath the surface, the way it rolled and dipped. Reed walked the perimeter with rubber waders and a long probe rod and mapped what he could reach. The soil under the standing water was dark, dense, not the sandy silt you'd expect from 4 years of standing water. He sent a sample to a university extension lab and didn't tell anyone what it was for. On the 6th day, Ranger found the wall. The dog had been wading the shallows all morning. Not the frantic wading of a dog playing in water, but the deliberate, methodical movement of an animal following something. A scent, maybe, a sound. Reed couldn't tell. He just followed Ranger the way he always followed Ranger when the dog moved like that, because that movement had never been wrong. The wall was stone. Old stone. The kind cut and stacked before anyone in this county was born. Each piece fitted to the next with a kind of precision that comes from time and care rather than machinery. It ran about 60 feet in a rough semicircle and stood maybe 4 feet tall, which meant for the past 4 years it had been entirely submerged. The interior of the semicircle was filled with silt, but the structure itself was intact, solid. Reed pressed both hands against it, and it didn't move. He stood there, in 18 inches of brown water, with his German shepherd next to him, and understood that he was looking at something that had been here a very long time. Something that had been here before the water. He didn't tell anyone about the wall that night. He sat outside the tent with a cup of coffee, and Ranger pressed against his leg, and he thought about what it meant to find something that was supposed to be lost. He'd done that in the Navy, in a different way. Finding the thing that wasn't on any chart. The thing that shouldn't be there. He'd learned that those were never accidents. This is the part of the story that still doesn't make full sense on the surface. The wall wasn't just old. It was deliberate. It had been positioned to enclose something, to protect something. And from the angle and the stonework, it looked to Reed's experienced eye like the foundation of a structure that had been removed rather than fallen, dismantled, not collapsed. The difference matters because one is time and the other is choice. Ranger paced the interior of the semicircle 3 times before sitting down in the center and looking at Reed. The next morning, Reed called his daughter and told her he'd found a stone wall. She said, "What does that mean?" He said, "I don't know yet, but it's why the land is worth something." She asked how he could possibly know that, and he said, "Because someone went to the trouble of hiding it." By the end of the second week, the water had dropped enough to reveal the orchard. 16 trees, 8 to a side, running in 2 parallel rows along the eastern edge of the property. They were old growth. The trunks were thick, the bark deeply furrowed, the kind of girth that takes 50 years or more. The variety was something Reed didn't recognize, with small, dense clusters of secondary branches that had survived 4 years of submersion in a way most fruit trees wouldn't. He photographed them and sent the images to the State Agricultural Extension Office with a note asking for identification. The answer came back in 48 hours. The extension agent, a woman named Dr. Patricia Voss, called him directly, rather than emailing. She said she needed to confirm what she was looking at because she hadn't seen this variety in the field before, only in the university's Heritage Seed Archive. What she was looking at, if his photos were accurate, was a cultivar of apple that had been documented in Calhoun County records in the 1892 and was believed extinct. The trees were based on the trunk diameter and secondary branching structure, approximately 90 to 100 years old. They had not just survived the flooding. In several of the trees, Dr. Voss said she could see new growth emerging from the upper branches. Reed asked her what they were worth. She said the scientific value was significant. Then she said the agricultural value was harder to calculate quickly, but that heritage apple varieties with this age and provenance on verified historic land, with documented regional lineage, attracted serious attention from specialty growers and preservation organizations. She asked who owned the property. He told her he did. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "Mr. Calloway, you should probably talk to a lawyer before you say much more to anyone else." Reed thanked her and hung up. He looked at Ranger, who was lying beneath one of the apple trees, his chin on the ground, watching the water recede at the property's low end. The soil lab report came back the following day. And this is where the story stopped being about a flooded farm and started being about something else entirely. The soil tested in the top 2% of agricultural productivity for the region. Nitrogen-rich, excellent drainage capacity beneath the clay layer. Strong mineral composition. The extension specialist who wrote the report included a note at the bottom that read, and Reed kept this note. He kept it in the drawer of his desk. Whoever farmed this land previously understood what they had. This level of soil health at this depth does not happen naturally in a generation. This was built over decades of careful practice. Someone had farmed this land with real intention, real knowledge, and real care. The water had come after that. and the care had been buried, and the land had sat under 4 feet of brown water, while everyone in Calhoun County laughed at the retired Navy man who bought it. Reed sat with that for a long time. The water was now down to a little over a foot in the center of the property. Ranger spent his evenings wading the edges, always returning to the stone wall, always sitting in its center for a while before coming back to camp. Reed had started sketching the layout of the property as it emerged. The stone semicircle, the orchard rows, the contour of the land beneath as the water pulled back. It looked planned. It looked like someone had designed a farm rather than simply worked one. He was sitting with that sketch on a Tuesday evening when the truck came up the road. It was a clean truck, dark blue, newer model, the kind of vehicle that announces money without announcing it too loudly. It stopped at the gate. A man got out. He was about 60, well-dressed in the casual way that cost real money. And he walked to the fence line and looked across the property the way people look at things they've already decided to buy. His name was Davis Whitmore. Reed didn't know that yet, but he would. Whitmore called over the fence in a friendly voice that Reed recognized immediately as a negotiating voice, dressed in a friendly costume. He said he'd heard Reed had picked up the alderman tract and that he was interested in discussing an offer. Reed walked over to the fence. They shook hands through the gate. Whitmore said the property was tricky, complicated by the flooding situation and the drainage issues, and that he had a development project nearby that could actually use some of the acreage, so he was prepared to be generous. Generous being his word, and was thinking somewhere in the territory of $75,000. Reed looked at the man. He'd spent 22 years reading faces in situations where reading a face wrong could end badly. And what he saw in Davis Whitmore's face was not generosity. It was urgency dressed as confidence. A man who needed something and had decided the best way to get it was to act like he was doing you a favor. Reed said he wasn't interested in selling. Whitmore smiled, the smile of someone who'd heard that before. He said he understood, no pressure, but that his offer had a soft deadline tied to his project timeline, the end of the dry season, maybe 8 or 10 weeks out. And he'd hope Reed would reconsider. He left a card on the fence post and drove away. Reed picked up the card. He turned it over. Whitmore Development Partners. A post office box 3 counties away. He took a photo of the card and sent it to his daughter. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains everything. Reed had been in the county 6 weeks at this point. He talked to farmers at the supply store, to the woman who ran the county records office, to the mechanic who serviced his pump, to the postal carrier who came down the road every morning. He'd been the target of jokes, but he'd also been, in the way that quiet and competent men become over time, someone people found themselves talking to honestly. He had that quality, the quality of a person who listens without rushing you, without waiting for his turn to speak. People trusted that. So when he started asking careful questions about water, drainage in the valley, he found answers faster than Davis Whitmore probably would have liked. The drainage system in the area ran through a series of agricultural channels, some of them going back to the 1942nd County Improvement Projects. The channel that fed the Alderman tract, the one whose blockage had flooded the property, ran through a culvert system that passed under a stretch of land on the northwest edge of the county. That stretch of land was owned by a holding company. The holding company's registered agent, Reed, found through state business records that were technically public, was Whitmore Development Partners. Reed sat with that for a very long time. He didn't accuse anyone of anything. He didn't post anything online. He didn't call the county commissioner or the local newspaper. What he did was drive to the State Agricultural College on a Thursday morning, walk into the office of the dean of the Land Management Department, set down a printed map of the drainage system with the ownership information annotated in red pen, and say very quietly, "I'd like your professional opinion on whether this configuration is consistent with a natural drainage failure." The dean studied the map. She asked several clarifying questions. She said she'd need to visit the site and review the county records on the culvert modification history before she could say anything on the record. But off the record, what she said was this: "A drainage system of this design does not fail at this specific point, in this specific direction, flooding this specific tract, and not the adjacent ones, without a modification upstream. Natural failures diffuse. They don't redirect." Reed thanked her. He drove back to the farm. Ranger was waiting at the tent entrance. The sun was going down over the western tree line, and the water was lower than it had been any day yet, maybe 9 inches in the deepest section. And in the fading light, the property looked different than it had the first day. It looked like it was rising. What you have to understand about Calhoun County is that it runs on who you know, the way all small counties do. The person who holds the old information is more valuable than the person who holds the new money, and both of them understand that. Reed had been there 6 weeks, and he didn't know anybody who mattered. Not yet. But Ranger was about to fix that. There was a man who came down the road on a tractor every Tuesday and Thursday morning. An old red machine, paint faded to the color of dried clay, that made a sound Reed recognized as a diesel engine, with a particular knock that meant it hadn't been serviced recently, but that whoever ran it knew exactly how far it could be pushed before it needed attention. The man who drove it was somewhere in his mid-70s. Lean, deliberate in his movements, with hands that told the story of his life better than any resume. His name was Emmett Souls. Emmett had slowed down on his first pass and looked at the pump operation with the specific attention of a man who knows what he's looking at. He hadn't said anything. He drove past again on Thursday and slowed again. On the following Tuesday, he stopped the tractor entirely, cut the engine, and sat there for a moment before climbing down and walking to the fence. Ranger had gone to the fence to meet him before Reed even saw him. That was how Reed knew Emmett Souls was going to be important. Ranger greeted very few people that way, moving to them rather than watching them. The dog went to the fence and sat, which was as close as Ranger came to an open invitation. Emmett looked at the dog for a long moment. Then he said to the dog, rather than to Reed, "You found something under all that water, didn't you?" It wasn't a question. Reed walked over. They introduced themselves. Emmett shook hands without ceremony and looked out at the property, the way old farmers look at land they've known a long time. He was quiet for a while, and then he said, "I farmed 2 fields over from this place for 30 years, the Alderman family. Before that, what's under the water?" Reed told him about the stone wall, the orchard, the soil report. Emmett didn't look surprised. He looked, if anything, satisfied, the look of someone who'd suspected the answer for a long time and was finally hearing it confirmed. He said, "Hector Alderman's grandfather built that wall. Built it to shelter the growing beds from the west wind. The apple variety was his grandmother's, brought from somewhere in Germany originally, been adapted to this soil for 60 years before I was born." He paused. "The soil condition you're describing, I know it. You couldn't get a bad yield off that land with a blindfold and a bad attitude." Reed asked him how the flooding had happened. Emmett's jaw tightened. He was quiet for long enough that Reed understood the silence was not about not knowing. It was about how to say what he knew. Finally, Emmett said, "I filed a report with the county drainage board 4 years ago. said the culvert modification on the northwest access road had altered the natural water flow. They said the modification was within permitted variance. He looked at Reed. There's one man in this county who's donated to every drainage board member's campaign in the last 12 years. His name is Davis Whitmore. Reed didn't say anything. He looked out at the property. The stone wall was almost entirely visible now. Ranger was wading toward it through the retreating water, moving with his usual deliberate purpose. Emmett watched the dog for a moment and then said, "That's a fine dog." What's he looking for out there? Reed said he'd been trying to figure that out for the better part of 6 weeks. Emmett said, "Some dogs can smell the difference between dead ground and living ground. I had a shepherd on this property 40 years ago. She'd always go to the best soil, just sit on it." He watched Ranger settle into his spot in the center of the stone semicircle. "That dog's been sitting in the same place every evening, hasn't he?" Reed said he had. Emmett said quietly, "That's where the root cellar is." The root cellar. Reed had mapped everything he could reach above the water line. He had not mapped what was under the water in the center of that stone semicircle, precisely because the water was still too deep and the silt too unstable. But if Emmett was right, and in 4 weeks of knowing Emmett's souls, Reed had never once caught him being wrong about anything related to this land, then what was down there, sealed under 4 feet of water and 4 years of accumulated silt, was a structure, a root cellar, built into the earth, stone-lined, sealed against moisture by design. The kind of structure that, if it had been properly constructed, might have preserved what was inside it. Reed asked Emmett how big it was. Emmett said, "Big enough. Hector's grandfather wasn't a small thinker." They stood at the fence for another hour, the old farmer and the retired Navy man, while the sun finished going down and the temperature dropped, and Ranger came back from the stone wall and sat between them like he belonged to both of them equally. Emmett told him about the land as it had been, the yields, the varieties, the heritage of the soil, the specific drainage patterns that made this parcel produce when other parcels in the same valley struggled. He told him about the Alderman family, 3 generations of farmers who understood that land wasn't something you owned, but something you maintained a relationship with. And then Emmett told him something that made everything else land differently. He said, 4 years ago, the month before the flooding started, a man came to Hector's estate sale, bought some equipment, some tools, made several very pointed comments about the land being in bad shape and difficult to use. 2 months later, the drainage culvert had been modified. 6 months after that, the estate was asking $65,000 for a property that should have appraised at $400,000. Reed looked at him. "You knew this the whole time," Emmett said. "I reported it. I was told it was coincidence. I'm an old farmer with one signed statement and no political connections. Whitmore has been buying up distressed land in this valley for 8 years. He's never paid market rate for any of it. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. And it starts not with lawyers or county officials or newspaper reporters, but with 2 men standing at a fence line in the dark while a German shepherd sat between them, and one of them said to the other, very quietly, "What do you need from me?" Reed said, "Everything you know, in writing, from the beginning." Emmett said, "I've had it written down for 4 years, was waiting for someone who could use it." The following 2 weeks were the hardest of the whole story. Not because of the physical work, though there was plenty of that. They began excavating the area around the stone wall by hand, carefully, the way you approach something old and significant, rather than something you want to get through quickly. But because of the pressure, Whitmore came back, not in person this time. Through an intermediary, a local real estate agent named Carl Hessing, who Reed had seen twice at the county building, a man with the specific nervousness of someone carrying a message he doesn't want to deliver. Carl came with a revised offer of $90,000 and a harder deadline, 6 weeks, tied to a development approval window that Whitmore's project supposedly needed. Carl said it with the apologetic manner of a man who knows the offer is designed to look generous without being generous. Reed thanked Carl and said he was still not interested in selling. Carl said the offer might not still be on the table after the deadline. Reed said he understood. Carl left. Reed stood at the gate for a while after the car disappeared down the road, understanding what was happening. The offer wasn't an offer. It was a clock. Whitmore knew the water was receding. Whitmore knew that every week the farm drained was a week closer to the true value of the property becoming undeniable. The deadline wasn't about his development timeline. It was about Reed's discovery timeline. He needed Reed to sell before Reed understood what he was sitting on. Reed was already behind that deadline. He called Mara that night. She'd been following everything by phone, growing more alarmed and then more cautious. Then, as the soil reports came in and the orchard identification was confirmed, more focused. She had a friend who practiced environmental and agricultural law. She said she could ask the friend to take a look at the drainage records, if Reed could get them. Reed said the records were public. He already had them. What those records showed, with Emmett's notes alongside them and the county drainage board minutes going back 12 years, was a pattern. 3 other properties in the valley had experienced anomalous flooding events over the previous decade. All 3 had sold under market value within 18 months of the flooding. All 3 had been purchased by entities that, when you traced the ownership through the state business registry, connected back to Whitmore, or to companies with overlapping registered agents. The State Attorney General's Agricultural Fraud Division, it turned out, had not received a complaint about any of this. Not one. Reed's daughter's friend, the environmental lawyer, said that was about to change. Now here is where Ranger's role in this story deserves its proper weight. Because in the telling of what happened with the lawyers and the records and the complaint filings, it would be easy to forget that the entire chain of events started with a German shepherd pressing his nose to a truck window at a fence line and staring at 4 feet of brown water for 40 minutes like he could see what was underneath it. Ranger had been waiting the property every morning for 3 weeks by the time they reached the root cellar. Reed and Emmett had been excavating around the stone foundation carefully, a few inches at a time, when Ranger went into the center of the semicircle one morning and began digging. Not the exploratory pawing of a dog following a scent through loose earth. A deliberate, focused excavation, front paws driving straight down through the silt, with the kind of insistence that Reed had learned, over 3 years, to take seriously without question. Reed pulled him back gently, assessed the spot, and started digging himself with a flat shovel. 18 inches down, the shovel hit wood. Not rotten wood, not deteriorated wood. Hard, dense, aged wood that had been sealed against moisture by craft and by the 4 feet of water above it that, paradoxically, had probably saved it from the freeze-thaw cycles that destroy dry wood structures. Reed uncovered the frame of a hatch, approximately 4 feet by 4 feet, hinged with iron fittings that had oxidized but had not corroded through. The latch was a simple drop bar design, still in place, still functional, still locked. Reed sat back on his heels and looked at it for a long time. Emmett, who had come to the property that morning because he came every morning now, walked over and looked down at it. He said, softly, 60 years. Give or take. Rangers sat at the edge of the excavation and watched Reed's face. Reed found the latch bar, lifted it, and pulled the hatch open. The smell that came up was cool and old and rich, the smell of stone and earth and something organic underneath, not decay, but the particular depth of a place that has been sealed from time. Below the hatch, rough stone steps descended into darkness. Reed got a flashlight from his truck and climbed down. The root cellar was approximately 12 feet by 20 feet. Stone walls, stone floor, arched ceiling that had been sealed with clay mortar, thick enough to hold against the water above for 4 years without yielding. Along the walls, built-in wooden shelving still intact. On the shelves, glass jars, hundreds of them, sealed with wax, most still intact. And in the back corner, a wooden chest, iron-banded, a thing that looked like it had been placed there, with the intention that someone would come back for it. Reed opened the chest. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were documents, deed records, survey maps, 3 generations of detailed farm records, planting histories, soil amendments, yield data going back to the 1,890 seconds. And underneath all of that, in a separate wrapped bundle, sealed documents in a language Reed didn't immediately recognize. He would later learn it was German. Letters and land records corresponding to the original farm established by the Alderman family's immigrant ancestors, documenting the heritage of the apple variety and the soil practices they'd carried from the old country. Emmett climbed down behind him. He saw the chest. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Hector always said his grandfather had buried the important things. Nobody knew where." Reed looked at the documents. He thought about what they meant, not just as history, though they were that. Not just as legal records, though several of them, including original survey maps that predated the county's own records, would turn out to be significant for reasons nobody had anticipated. But as evidence that this land had a story that went back further than the water, further than Hector Alderman's death, further than Davis Whitmore's schemes, further than the laughter at the diner. This farm had been loved. Seriously, carefully, across generations. And someone had gone to the trouble of making sure that love didn't disappear under the water. Reed sat down on the stone floor of that root cellar with a flashlight and a dog and a 74-year-old farmer who had been waiting 4 years for someone to find this, and he understood, the way you understand things in the field, not in the office, that the farm was never going to be sold to Davis Whitmore. Not for $90,000. Not for $900,000. The state attorney general's office received the complaint 6 days later. The filing included Emmett's notarized statement, the records of the 3 prior Valley properties, the county drainage board minutes, the state business registry connecting Whitmore's entities, the engineering analysis from the University Land Management Department documenting that the drainage modification could not have been accidental, and a separate letter from Dr. Patricia Voss at the Extension Office documenting the heritage apple cultivar and the significance of the soil profile. It was not a thin complaint. Reed's daughter's friend, the environmental lawyer whose name was Sheila Park, said it was one of the most completely documented initial filings she had submitted in 14 years of practice. She said it the way that lawyers say things when they are genuinely surprised. Whitmore's people made 2 more attempts. The first was a letter, through his attorney, asserting that the drainage modification had been permitted, and that any suggestion of intentional flooding would be vigorously contested. The second was a visit to Emmett Soul's property by a man Emmett described as polite, well-dressed, and very interested in whether Emmett had any outstanding debts or maintenance obligations on his equipment. Emmett told the man he'd been managing debt and equipment his entire life, and he'd be delighted to continue doing so. The man left. If you're wondering how that level of pressure feels on two men and a German shepherd camped on a reclaimed farm in Calhoun County, it feels exactly like you'd expect. Reed had been in situations with real stakes before. He'd had operations go sideways in ways that had consequences measured in more serious terms than property values. So he had a particular capacity for sitting with threat and not reacting to it, which had served him in the Navy and served him here. He slept well. Ranger slept well. Emmett brought coffee from his house every morning and they worked. The water was down to a film across the low center now. The property was emerging fully, 140 acres of land that had been invisible for 4 years, revealing itself like something waking up. The orchard stood in its 2 rows, the new growth on the old trees visible and undeniable, a kind of testimony. The stone wall stood clear, the root cellar hatch visible from the road. The soil as it dried darkened to the color in the lab report, the specific rich darkness of ground that has been built rather than depleted. Reed walked the property most evenings with Ranger, moving ahead of him, the dog quartering back and forth across the land, with the systematic thoroughness that Reed had come to understand was simply how Ranger experienced a place he'd decided to care about. On evenings when the light was right, the whole property had a quality that was difficult to name, but easy to feel, like it had been waiting. The first formal acknowledgement from the Attorney General's office came 43 days after the complaint was filed. An investigator had been assigned. The drainage modification records were being subpoenaed. 2 of the 3 prior Valley property sales were under review for potential fraud in the procurement process. And in a development that Sheila Park described as unusually rapid for state government, the County Drainage Board had received a formal inquiry regarding the permitting documentation for the Northwest Culvert modification. Davis Whitmore's offer lapsed. No extension was made. 3 weeks after the Attorney General's acknowledgement, the county held what it called a drainage modification review hearing, a technical, unglamorous proceeding held in a conference room at the county building with 11 people present, most of them holding clipboards. Reed attended, Emmett attended, Sheila Park attended by phone. The county's own engineer, reviewing the modification records for the first time with fresh eyes and under scrutiny, said on the record that the permitted variance documentation did not appear to cover the degree of alteration that had actually been made. That was the moment. Not dramatic, not loud, not the kind of moment that makes for good television. Just an engineer reading paperwork in a conference room and saying carefully that the numbers didn't match. Reed drove back to the farm after that hearing and told Ranger what had happened. He knew how that sounded. He'd been talking to the dog since the day he brought him home, and he'd stopped apologizing for it about 6 months in. Ranger listened the way he always listened. Fully, patiently, with a specific quality of attention that felt, whether you were being rational about it or not. Like comprehension, the investigation took 5 months in total. What it found, documented in a final report that ran to 112 pages and was later summarized in state agricultural news publications, was this. Whitmore Development Partners had, over a period of 11 years, in 4 of those 7 acquisitions, the distress condition could be directly linked to upstream drainage modifications made by entities controlled by Whitmore or his partners within 24 months preceding the sale. The modifications had been permitted through a process that, the report concluded diplomatically, reflected inadequate oversight at the county level, which was a way of saying something had gone wrong somewhere in the approval chain that had not been asked about enough. Whitmore was not prosecuted personally. His development entities faced civil liability. 2 county officials resigned. The drainage modifications were ordered reversed, and the county was directed to fund the reversal, which meant that the northwest culvert returned to its original configuration, and the natural drainage patterns that had existed before were restored, which Reed didn't need because he'd already drained his farm himself. But which mattered, for the future of the land and for the principle of the thing. The principle of the thing mattered to Reed. The 3 prior Valley property owners, who had sold under distressed conditions, received a settlement through the civil process. Emmett filed a statement on behalf of the Alderman estate's legitimate heirs, Hector's grandchildren, 4 of them, scattered across the country who had not known about any of this, and those heirs received a portion of the settlement as well. Reed did not profit from the investigation. He had paid $60,000 for land that, by the time the investigation concluded and the soil reports and orchard identification and root cellar documentation were fully on the record, was assessed at something considerably more than that. But the county assessment was not what mattered to him. What mattered was the farm. Emmett knew farmers in the region who had been looking for heritage apple varieties suitable for the local soil conditions. By the following spring, the orchard had drawn the attention of 3 specialty growers, 2 regional preservation organizations, and a university research partnership that wanted to study the century-old cultivar in its original growing environment. The root cellar, once properly cleaned and cataloged, had yielded enough farm history to interest the County Historical Society, which was not an institution Reed had previously had any reason to think about. The diner in town still had most of the same people it had always had. Reed went in on a Tuesday in the spring. Following everything, took a booth near the window and ordered coffee. The waitress, who had been there the day someone first called him the Admiral of the Swamp, brought his coffee without comment and gave him a look that contained, if he was reading it right, something between acknowledgement and embarrassment. He didn't press it. He drank the coffee and left a good tip and went back to the farm. The selectman named Gerald Pruitt had lost his seat in the November election to a retired schoolteacher who had campaigned in part on the county drainage board's management failures. Reed hadn't voted in local elections before. He voted in that one. There was a morning in late April when Reed walked the property from the road to the far eastern edge, Ranger moving ahead of him through the new grass that had come up across the reclaimed ground with a density and greenness that surprised even Emmett, who said he hadn't seen grass like that on this land in 30 years. The apple trees were in bloom. 16 trees, century-old survivors, covered in white and pale pink flowers that had no business being as abundant as they were after 4 years underwater. But there they were. Reed stood at the eastern fence line and looked back across his land, all of it visible now, all of it real. The stone wall, the orchard, the root cellar hatch in its cleared excavation, the pump long since removed, the drainage channels running clean, 140 acres of the most fertile ground in the valley sitting under a spring sky. Ranger came back from the far end of the orchard and sat next to Reed and looked at the same thing Reed was looking at. The county had laughed for about 6 months. Then they'd stopped, not because anyone in the diner stood up and made a speech, or because the local paper ran a big apology. People just quietly stopped laughing, the way people do when the thing they were laughing about turns out to be the thing they should have been paying closer attention to. Reed didn't hold it against them. In his experience, most people aren't cruel. They're just not paying attention. They look at a flooded field and see a flooded field. They see what's on the surface. They don't think about what the water might be hiding, or what the man who bought it might already know that they don't. He thought about his daughter, who had asked him, "Are you sure about this?" and accepted his no as a sufficient answer, and who had found the lawyer who had helped turn Emmett's 4-year-old written testimony into a 112-page state investigation. He called her most evenings now, from the step of the old farmhouse he'd been rebuilding on the western edge of the property, the one that had sat underwater so long that the lower framing had needed replacing, but the stone foundation, the same local stone, the same careful construction, had been solid. He thought about Emmett, who had driven past this property on a tractor twice a week for 4 years, carrying information he'd had no way to use, and waiting without knowing he was waiting for the right person to stop at the fence. Emmett came by most mornings now. He had opinions about the orchard and the soil amendment schedule and the cover crop rotation that he delivered with the authority of someone who had been right about this land his entire life, which he had been. Reed mostly listened. That was a habit he had. He thought about Ranger sitting in the center of that stone semicircle in 18 inches of water, patient and certain, waiting for Reed to catch up to what the dog had already known. The real question about this story isn't whether a veteran with $60,000 and a German Shepherd could take on a developer with a decade's head start and county board connections and come out on the other side with the land intact. Obviously he could. The real question is what made him stop at the fence that third time. What made him trust the dog's attention over the county assessor's valuation, over the diner's laughter, over his own doubt. Reed Calloway would tell you he isn't a mystical person. He'd tell you he makes decisions based on information and pattern recognition, the same way he navigated everything from ship operations to divorce proceedings. He'd tell you Ranger isn't magic. He's just a very good dog with superior sensory equipment and 3 years of accumulated trust. He'd tell you all of that, and he'd be right. But he'd also tell you, if you sat with him long enough, that there's a kind of knowledge that doesn't come from looking at the surface of things, that some of the most important information you'll ever receive arrives not through the obvious channels, but through the quiet, steady attention of something that loves what it's looking at without needing to explain why. That's what the farm had been trying to say for 4 years, sitting under that water, holding its stone walls and its old trees and its century of careful soil and its sealed root cellar, full of documents that remembered what it had been, waiting for someone to pump the water back and look at what was underneath. Most people drove past it twice. Reed Calloway drove past it twice, and then stopped on the third pass because his German Shepherd pressed his nose to the glass. The orchard is in its 3rd season of active production now. The heritage apple variety has been formally documented in the state agricultural registry. The root cellar has been restored and is sealed and functioning the way a good root cellar should be, which is to say, it maintains temperature without assistance and keeps what's inside it safe from what's outside it. Emmett Souls farms his 2 fields to the west every season and comes by most mornings with coffee and opinions. The farm the county laughed at is the richest agricultural land in the valley. Ranger is 7 years old. He still walks the orchard every morning. He still sits in the center of the stone semicircle for a few minutes each evening. The way he has since the first week. The way he was doing when the water was still 4 feet deep and nobody could see what was under it. Maybe he's watching for something. Maybe he already found everything he was looking for. Maybe for a dog that good, the 2 things are the same. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever stood at a fence line looking at something everyone else was walking past, or if you've ever put your trust in a quiet creature who turned out to know exactly what they were doing, hit subscribe. There are more stories like this one. Stories about what gets buried and what comes back up and what it costs to stay patient. Long enough to find out what's underneath. Every one of them has a dog in it. Every single one.